Willkommen zur Lektion 6 dieses MOOC, für die wir Tara Andrews eingeladen haben. Sie ist Professorin für Digital Humanities am Institut für Geschichte der Universität Wien. In ihrer Forschung befasst sich Tara Andrews mit digitalen und computergestützten Zugängen zu den Geisteswissenschaften. Im Projekt Releven, auf das sie im Verlauf dieser Lektion eingehen wird, beschäftigt sie sich mit der Verknüpfung großer Mengen an unterschiedlichen Daten, um so neue Einsichten in das 11. Jahrhundert zu gewinnen. Neue Forschungsmethoden einer digitalen Welt also, die uns helfen sollen, eine 1000 Jahre alte Welt besser zu verstehen. Das erste Video von Tara Andrews widmet sich der Frage, über die Sie wahrscheinlich gerade selbst nachdenken. Was sind denn Digital Humanities überhaupt? In den nächsten 10 Minuten wird uns Tara Andrews über die Ursprünge und Anliegen dieses Fachs berichten. Von frühen Rechenmaschinen, die eingesetzt wurden, um verschiedene Aufgaben nicht mehr händisch durchführen zu müssen, bis zum Aufkommen des Internets und der Publikation von wissenschaftlichen Arbeiten in digitalen Medien. Tara Andrews erklärt uns, wie die digitale Transformation die Denktraditionen und Methoden der Geisteswissenschaften beeinflusst. Sie bezieht sich auf verschiedene Teilbereiche der Digital Humanities und zeigt, wie weitreichend und tiefgehend diese Veränderungen bereits sind. Und sie verdeutlicht, wie notwendig eine digitale Perspektive auf die Geisteswissenschaften weiterhin sein wird.
Hello, my name is Tara Andrews, and I'm the professor for digital humanities here at the University of Vienna. The first question I'm usually asked when I tell people what I do for a living is what that actually means. What on earth is digital humanities? That isn't such an easy question to answer. In fact, there's a website, whatisdigitalhumanities.com, that will currently give you any of 817 different answers to that question. I invite you after this lecture to play with the website and think about the definitions that different people have given. In the meantime, I'm going to present my own understanding of the field. Digital humanities had its beginnings under the name of humanities computing. As early as 1947, humanities scholars were already awake to the possibilities of using this amazing computation machine to do various bits of drudge work, calculation, and indexing that they had, up until that point, always had to do by hand. Just the ability to make fast and accurate counts of words, for example, opened the way to concordance projects, to vocabulary studies, to statistical methods for identifying authors of texts by their style, and many similar things. Over the course of the 1990s and early 2000s, as the internet became widespread and web browsers became the preferred means of access to almost everything on the internet, the humanities scholars who were already using computers quite heavily in their work, they were quick to take advantage of the new medium to publish their work either as digital books on CD-ROM, remember CD-ROM, or entirely online as websites. This in turn sparked a lot of discussion about the sorts of things you can do with online publications that are impossible in books, for example, free text search or dynamic visualizations, and what they signify for how we communicate our work. Meanwhile, as time marched on into the 2000s and 2010s, we had an increasingly obvious problem on our hands. How do we make sure that all this wonderful digital work of ours survives into the future? Our CD-ROM publications were increasingly useless. Our websites, published in the 1990s, were quickly disappearing from the internet as scholars retired and servers were shut down and domain names were left unrenewed. Even worse, how could we be sure that the website we saw in 2015 still said the same thing as it had done in 2005? How could we even prove what was there in 2005, enough to be able to cite it in any later work? What if our wonderful scholarly arguments could be torpedoed into nonsense by having their supporting publications changed out from under them? So, I would argue that the history of our field lets us think of the digital humanities as a few distinct but overlapping subfields, or spaces. The first space is what we might call computing the humanities. You can, if you like, think of this as the data processing chunk. It's the natural home of those first digital humanists who worked on computer-generated index and concordances, on statistical studies of the words in a text to try and identify their authors, and so on. But as computers became more powerful and their capabilities became more obvious, it has come to include a whole lot more. We can think of natural language processing of the sort that feeds into machine translation and even artificial intelligence-based chatbots such as ChatGPT. We can think of historical social network analysis or machine learning methods to read and transcribe handwritten texts and manuscripts, or large-scale modeling and analysis, such as the literary patterns that can be fished out of Google Books data. The second space in digital humanities might be described conversely as humanizing the computers. This is what we get when we think of digital humanities as being a branch of media studies, which in fact some scholars have argued for, and with some reason. If we're going to use this extremely accessible new medium, what does it mean for how we can or should engage the public in academic work? In practice, this space is most often populated by projects such as online archives, digital libraries, the curation of digital collections of letters or museum artifacts or postcards or photographs. The primary purpose of these sorts of projects is to create, maintain, and ensure the completeness and longevity of the data. There's also a theoretical side which is based very strongly on media studies. You may have heard the saying, "the medium is the message." This is one of those foundational ideas in media studies, which says that we can't really separate out what is being communicated with how it is being communicated. It says that hearing a message on the radio, reading it in a book, and seeing it on the TV all make a difference, actually, to the message itself and how we understand it. So the question for digital humanities becomes, how does the digital medium affect the scholarly message? How does a person's understanding of their culture improve when they can interact with these collections of letters and postcards instead of just seeing them on a shelf or in book illustrations? The third space in digital humanities basically revolves around, how do we get all of this done? All of this work requires a massive amount of new infrastructure, not only in terms of computers and servers and wires, but also in terms of people and education and training. All the stuff that is needed if our field is to be remotely feasible. In practice, it involves the creation of data repositories and networks of best practice for tools and methods, which leads in turn to summer schools and training camps and degree programs and opportunities to learn things. And it's one of the first places where we can quite clearly talk about accountability in the humanities. Once our work can be made available online, then who should have access to it? To what extent are we accountable to the businesses, the publishers, who produce our articles and books? And to what extent are we accountable to the public, the taxpayers, whose money goes into the budgets that pay our salaries? How do we balance these obligations? You may have heard of peer review. This is how most scholarly work is validated, by getting the opinions of some well-respected fellow academics about whether that work is sound. And it's usually organized by these academic publishers. But if we don't need a publisher at all, if we can just toss our research output onto the nearest website, then who holds us accountable for its quality? Of course, these questions are not exclusive to the humanities. Digital preservation, open access, peer review systems, these are also important in the natural and applied sciences. So, some would argue that, strictly speaking, these infrastructure issues are not really inherently part of the digital humanities at all. But if we left them out, then this would leave us with digital humanities as media studies on the one hand and as empirical and quantitative humanities on the other. Neither side quite appreciating or trusting what the other is doing. Frankly, this isn't a nice picture. And it has already led to the occasional community dispute. On top of that, what do we do about judgment and interpretation when we try to get the computer to help us with humanities work? It's obvious that we can't leave questions of interpretation to the computer because algorithms don't interpret. Algorithms don't understand. People do. So how, if at all, can the digital humanities cope with the heuristics and hermeneutics, the fuzziness and interpretation of meaning that are arguably what the humanities are all about? This is sometimes referred to as the hermeneutic gap, and figuring out how to bridge it is still a pretty big problem space. This is in fact the final digital humanities space that I want to mention. So far, it is much smaller than the others, and it arises naturally out of this kind of meta-reflective stance towards research in the humanities that emerged from the media theory space of digital humanities. But it also has plenty of roots in the humanities computing space, where in the other spaces, we're thinking about what computing does for the humanities. Here, we're trying to think about the question, what does computing do to the humanities? What effect does it have when we have all these new tools and higher standards of evidence on our ideas of what counts as good research? This means that we need to investigate the very nature of humanistic inquiry, that's what we do in the humanities, from a digital and scientific point of view. When we write computer programs, we're relying on digital models of whatever it is we're studying. So how do we make that model? To turn stuff into data and make it computable, we have to formalize it somehow. So what sorts of assumptions are we making in our formalizations? How do we know we're doing it in a way that makes sense? When we use other people's software, how do we know that we can trust them? Here again comes the question of accountability. How can we judge and know whether we can trust the computational methods and models that we rely on? Conversely, if it took this long for us to start formalizing our work properly, how do we know we can trust all that work in history and literature studies and art history that came before? I'll leave you here with some of these general questions brewing. In the next two videos, we will look at specific projects in the digital humanities and how they engage with accountability in two different directions. First, to keep a scholar accountable to him or herself concerning the interpretations and judgments she or he is making. And second, to keep track of who is accountable for which piece of information in a larger world of facts, interpretations, and ideas. We'll wrap up this unit with a video that looks to the future. What do we do in digital humanities when we have so much data we can't study it normally anymore?